I just wanted to talk a little bit about the workflow that I've been using before. So I started doing this in something called Aider, which I think is maybe one of the OG command line applications. So you could run this. I just want to show that I've got this running with an API key for my environmental variable. I started off on this project using Gemini 2.5 Pro. And as usual, I was watching YouTube while quote unquote coding. And I saw an announcement for Gemini CLI. So I thought, hey, I'm using this model already. Why don't I swap over to that? Now, previously, I tried using something called Goose as well, which is pretty good. It's open source. You can use Olama, and it's pretty handy. But I figured I should try the new hotness. So right now, it feels like Claude Code is what everyone's using. And I think on the, is it Codex from the OpenAI side? Is a tool similar to that? There's also another one called Open Code that I played around with, but I spent a lot of my time in Claude Code. And it feels to me because maybe I'm used to 3.5, 3.7, and 4.0 just in terms of dealing with TypeScript, JavaScript, CSS, seems to be a pretty easy way to go and generally works really well for me. And I think for you as well. You were probably the person to introduce it to me. And then once I tried it, I realized that it's way better than anything else. Now, Gemini itself has some pretty cool things to it that I'll talk about here in a minute. But I think one of the main differentiators for me, and I've got this turned on, you can kind of see it at the bottom here, is the sandbox. So basically, I can run this. It's got a YOLO mode. If you're feeling lucky, we'll be using that today. If you want to see my YOLO experiments, there is a video on the site about it, but I'm a little bit more hesitant to use YOLO mode. The other thing is when I started off this project, I started with my iPad, actually. I was remote desktop controlling my Mac. And it felt to me like that I tend to use Git a lot to track my changes when I'm doing vibe coding. I want to make sure I can, back up, look at the things I've done before. If there's any mistakes, roll back to what I had. The problem I've got with that is because I'm not pushing to GitHub and I'm just using Git locally, often I can't find where the projects are. I just got to put a note on that. But basically, a lot of times what I'm trying to do is checkpoint things. I feel like I need a better system of maybe describing an endpoint that I could use for my AI coding assistants. And we chatted about that a little bit this morning. I think you've got some really good ideas. But for now, what ends up happening is I end up trying one of these tools, command line. I'll have some window somewhere. I'll forget what I'm using. And in this case, I run it using NPX. So I want to just quickly bring up here. I'm just going to pop out of the screen here. Just going to quickly bring up the install because you can install this either sort of the easy way or the hard way. And I feel like the easy way to get started is just running NPX. So you can straight up just run this command in a way where essentially it just runs. So give me 1 second here. I'll pull up the installation. The command that you can run is this, which actually will install it, but might not install to your path. So the first thing was like deciding which computer I had installed it on was the biggest problem. And just to make this a little bit bigger here. So basically all we're looking at is just npx github.com/Google Gemini -CLI. That's awesome. It will install it. If it's not in your path, you may lose it. The other way to install this, which is what I'm going to recommend here, is this. So if we just do, my apologies, one of these, we can do an npm install globally and then run the Gemini command after that. And I feel like that's probably the best way to install it. I just wanted to quickly touch on that because it's one of those things where obviously it caused me problems. It'll probably cause other people problems as well. But once installed, this is the UI that you get. So you run Gemini, got quite a bit of things you could do, but there are a couple things I want to point out as well before we get started. So I'm just going to exit this. One of the things is, I'm just going to run Z here. So Z is an editor, like a cursor or what have you, that I've been playing around with. I like it because it's a little bit smaller. So this is the newer install that I've got here. Quickly look at this file here. So all I've done is define an MCP server, and hopefully this is big enough. And just as we were talking about with Google Gemini, we can run this as a single command using npx, which is actually quite handy. So we can point it at something like, in this case, we're pointing at the model context protocol repo. And then there's something called sequential thinking. Now, sequential thinking I've introed in other episodes, but essentially it's a way to do this and then think of it and then do that. There's a few more implementations in there. There's one called memory. It's another one called fetch if you want to do web searches. But I want to show that we can add MCP servers to Gemini, just as we will with Claude Code or with Cursor or with Windsurf or what have you. Similarly for Z. Now, the only other full command in here is the sandbox. Now, the sandbox allows me to run the session in a sandbox. In this case, I'm defining that I want to use the Google Gemini sandbox that they allow you to use. And I'll show what that looks like here in a moment once we start it up. But this is all you need for the config. And this is in the folder for the project. Now, you could actually put it in like a global folder in your home folder if you wanted to. But once we start up, you'll see that there's a couple things I have. One, it loads my MCP tool. So I'll hit Control T just to show you that. And you can actually look at it here. So it can show you all the things that sequential thinking can do. Essentially what it's going to do is problem solve. So that's the main takeaway or the main benefit that you get from sequential thinking. The other, again, is that we've got this sandbox running here. Now, just to describe this project a little bit, I'll create a Gemini.md file here in a moment, but what I expect it to find when we look through the repo is what I'm trying to do is use MDX files and markdown files. When you're adding them to an Astro site or a static build site, I'd like it to be able to build multiple languages. So if I've got content coming in English, maybe, just maybe, I don't know yet, I might be able to translate that into something like Spanish or Japanese. And I don't expect these to be the best results, but I have had pretty good results using Ada locally. Ada's from Cohere to do translations, to do local translations without necessarily paying for a service. Now, I'm doing this because I've worked with the Microsoft service in the past. I worked with the Google translation service. They're actually quite expensive. And I'm not going to say that this is cheaper. I had to get a video card to run this and things like that. But I guess in my brain, it's like a sunk cost. I've already got the GPU. So to run these on top of that should be close to nil in terms of cost. There's electricity cost as well. But to run something like an Ada model to translate text, I've done pages at a time. Doesn't take very long, doesn't seem to take a lot of power. So it felt like the right way to do this as like a local build server, or if we had GPU enabled instances. Now, I think we've talked before about Claude.md, and I know I've talked about todo.md. Gemini is no different. It's got a Gemini.md. What we're going to do here is quickly read this project file and see if we can generate Gemini.md. Now, one thing I do want to say is that the model I'm using is Gemini 2.5 Pro. I'd added a key to it because I think this morning we were talking about this. One of the problems is if you're just using like your Gmail account or something like that, you will be able to use 2.5 Pro, but you only get about 3 or 4 calls until it says it's running slow, and it'll swap over to Flash. And Flash is a great model. And for a project this size, it might be fine. But once you get over 5 files, maybe 10 files, it feels like Flash isn't as good as 2.5 Pro. So I'm going to stick with the default here. What we're going to try to do is read the project, create that Gemini markdown file, and then decide what's next. So I'll read this project. Gemini.md file. Now, I'm so sorry for the all caps. I have said this does seem to just make it obvious that this is what I want to do. In it, at least, I would say in Gemini code, this doesn't necessarily always seem to be the problem. But in my case, this is what we want to use. So I'm going to allow this MCP call, just so when it goes through, it can use it for the next calls. But the one thing I want to point out is typically you will get that cancel or allow prompt from a lot of these tools. It's neither good nor bad, but it will tell you that you're actually using the MCP tool where it's not always obvious that you are. If you know what to look for, you'll see it. But in this case, what we're doing is we're reading through that project. And what we're going to do is, because I gave it a complex command, I want to move on to the next steps. Again, if you've used sequential thinking before, this is no different. You'll see that these are the same up here. You see that there's a thought number, how many thoughts it's got, what it's going to next, that kind of stuff. Okay, so we're just going to do, is it allowed to write a file? Yes, it can write to the Gemini.md file. And then again, once we've done that, what we can do is go into Z and look at the file to make sure it's got what we want. But essentially, we can start using this Gemini file the same way we would a Claude file or todo.md, or maybe you're using something like a cursor rules or what have you. And then I'm just going to quickly pop into here, into Z, and let's look at what it's spit out. Okay, so it actually got it, which is good. And I say this is important because this morning when I ran this exact same test using Flash, it did not do this. And in fact, it got confused and thought that it wanted me to integrate the sequential thinking into my project to use LLM calls in order to do translation. So it's not that it was necessarily wrong, but I could tell that it wasn't doing the tool call and that it maybe didn't digest the project properly. So I want to do a little bit of moving around. Sorry for the delays, but I wanted to make sure that the demo actually worked. Mm-hmm. It does seem to work, and it can see here what we're actually trying to do. So future development plans, et cetera, et cetera. And really, I guess at the end of the day, I don't feel like the Gemini CLI is any different than the other two that are out there. So Codex and Claude Code, or maybe even Go Open Code if you want. But one of the key differences for me, at least, is it uses Gemini 2.5 Pro, which is actually a quite good model in terms of context. So if you got larger projects, it might be that the differentiator is that it can handle a lot of context. The other is that it's not too expensive in terms of the output token. So it's not that bad. I think for input, it's probably on par with the auto models, but in terms of output, it's actually quite good.
Okay.
All this to say, just a quick intro today, nothing too complicated, but my frame of thought was, hey, I'm on my iPad. Can I do anything while I'm watching YouTube at the same time? I think you and I were talking about if you're doing a road trip or what have you, what can you use a background agent for? I guess is what I'm getting at. So if I've got a background agent that can run while I'm doing something and I just need to check in once in a while, what does that look like? I started off using Aider. And again, I was watching YouTube. They suggested Gemini CLI. So I guess I'm prompt driven as well. I was prompted to try Gemini CLI. And I was able to run that again from the iPad to my Mac while I'm doing something. But I think we're in a point now where, what would you call it? Code laundering, where I can start a project off in one and then continue in another. And it feels like some tools have different maybe skills or are better at some things. Personally, I find using a GUI tool like Cursor or Windsurf is easier for me to look at things like CSS because it's graphical. But I do find if I want to bang out something really quickly, almost like a no shot or a one shot or two shot application, the vibe coding tools are great. But if I want to do something a little bit more serious, I would generally reach for a Claude Code. And I feel like Gemini is like that flavor. Google. And I know that's a terrible conclusion, but basically just using the different tool for the job or the tool that seems to fit the job a little bit better is where I'm at now. I'm still not running multiple agents at the same time. I'm still a little bit nervous about YOLO mode and committing to GitHub, but this is the workflow that I've landed on at this point in time. And it's primarily Cloud Code. But I will say, after spending a weekend with Gemini CLI, it does look like something I want to explore more going forward.
It seems like these IDEs are converging, so where they all have the same. They look very similar. You're inside them; they have similar animations, and they're using colors, although it's all within the terminal. But it seems like, just in general, as all of these different tools learn from each other and steal ideas from each other and start again standardizing, the IDEs are like becoming a commodity, and it really sounds like it's still about the model that you're using underneath. Gemini code, or Gemini CLI rather, sounds amazing until it isn't, and the difference is the model, right? I do like how their MCP servers and all that kind of thing seems a little bit maybe easier than some of the other ones, Claude Code, although I have not gone in to spend a lot of time recently with Claude Code and setting all that up, but something about just the visual looked a little bit different, a little easier maybe.
It does. So on the one hand, it's a text file that you have to edit. So I understand that can be a bit of a hurdle for some people, especially when they're coming at vibe coding and more of like a click-driven development approach. On the other hand, I did really like the fact that I can go in and look at the MCP servers really easy using keyboard shortcuts like Command-T or Control-T, pardon me. Being able to see that quickly is quite handy. And it's one of those things I mentioned a little bit this morning, but I'm playing around with toying with making my own MCP servers. And one of the problems is that troubleshooting the MCP server when it's not working properly is difficult. But at least on the Gemini CLI side, you can easily see, hey, is it currently refreshed? What's the current status? If it's loaded, that's great, but does it have any tools? Is the other one that I've come across that causes problems. So being able to see all of that in a quick Command-T or Control-T is fantastic.
Now, have you explored the ability to use non-Google models? Do they offer that? Can you run local models or plug into any other providers?
I didn't see any options for that, though I think it's open source as far as it's on GitHub. As far as I can tell, you might be able to grab it down and see if you could change it. I will say, though, that the main advantage they've got at this point, I'm just looking at the screen trying to make sure I'm correct here, is the UI to me seems a little bit more simple than something like an Aider, for example, which can bog you down with a bunch of options. I'll show the help here in a moment, but there's not too many commands, which actually makes it quite nice. And some of these commands in here are pretty handy. So one of them that Aider does automatically, which is cool, but also I'd like more control about it, is compressing that context. So it'll compress the context as you go, depending on the model that you're using. But if you're using like something like Claude, for example, Claude Code, this is not something you have control over. So you can't tell how much context you have, unless I'm wrong. Having played with it, I think Thursday or Wednesday last week, it updates daily, so it's difficult. But as far as I can tell, you don't have control over that context. Whereas in here, you do, which is actually pretty handy. And the other thing that I thought was pretty neat is that you can set an external editor in here and hop in and hop back out if you want to. If you want to go in and surgically touch the files, which I often find when I'm running Cloud Code, I'll have a GUI editor on the other side, or Vi or Vim or something running on one of the main files, just watching it as it changes. Because to me, I guess that's how I like to supervise. Maybe I'm a micromanager. I want to see every line of the code that's going in. I want to see what's happening. A lot of times in Cloud Code, they'll give you like a summary of what's actually happening. But sometimes the code being written is a little bit, not that it's different, but it's still a little bit different than what it's being. So I like to watch it as I go along. But yeah, I think these keyboard shortcuts and commands are maybe a little bit different than a Cloud Code. But yeah, I don't know if that's the differentiating factor at this point in time, but it seems to really help.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, sounds like a win for those of us who are indifferent to the different providers of the rules and being able to. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's easy and even nice to be able to bounce around between different tools, whether that's because you've run out of tokens for the day, credits for the day, whatever it is, or hit some sort of barrier on the maximum amount of context you can send in a day. I'm constantly running into reasons why suddenly pick your model that I'm playing with says, hey, you're out of, we're done here today. And I'm like, I'm not done. And I just take my code and I take it somewhere else.
You take your toys out of the sandbox and find
Exactly. Okay, Claude, we're done here. I'm just going to go talk to somebody else today. And that's how it works. And I was using the word code laundering or LLM laundering or whatever. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean it like every time I like bounce back and forth between tools, it gets a little better, honestly.
Totally.
It's like 2 heads are better than 1 when you go back and forth, and one will catch bugs that the other created. And I don't know if that's the way you're supposed to do it per se, but it seems like I'm forced, and you are too, I think, sounds like, to do that sometimes. If you've got more time than whatever credit that they've given you in that day, why wouldn't you just move on to a new tool?
Absolutely.
Especially right now when we're trying to there's so many different tools to try to like play with and understand and learn and share with others what's going on. Like our toy box is huge. We'll just turn and go pick a different one and again, take our code with us. That's it. I think one of the things you were alluding to is the importance of using version control or something to check, set checkpoints of where you are with your code. But as you're also discovering, it might actually be where you need to take it even further and push it up into GitHub so that it's available to you in other places. On other devices, regardless of if you're in your lab or you're on your iPad or wherever.
Yeah, totally agree. Sorry, just playing around with one of the functions in here. I'd forgotten that there's actually a memory feature, for example. So just a last parting tip here. If you're finding that you're missing something like the cursor rules or windsurf rules, you can grab the ones that you're using. So in this case, I'm using one from the cursor directory, looking at Astro, Tailwind, cursor rules. All I did was grab a copy paste down here, hopped over into here, and then from the memory command, we can do an add, and then just within quotes, add a memory, or in this case, if you want to show what's already in there, we can show our memory. And you can see that it's got that long list of how you might actually author Astro with Tailwind. This is important because though you may say, this is what I want, instead of repeating yourself over and over, sometimes it's handy having missing in there. Now, I will say this is a pretty large memory. It might be that you don't need all of this. Sometimes I find that the cursor rules can be a little bit large, but with Gemini Pro, you've got a fair amount of context, and I don't have any concern about adding it here for this model. But you're absolutely right. Depending on the model that you've got, you may need to adapt or adopt a different way of working that will allow you to use some guidelines.
Excellent. Okay, cool. Appreciate you sharing what you've discovered, and we will now share that with others in hopes that we can learn about this stuff. And yeah, thanks so much. And I guess with that, we'll see you on the next one.
Bye, folks.